In this video, we will consider the methods of disease transmission. Knowledge of transmission is essential for the development of control protocols that will prevent further infections by pathogenic microbes. Your objectives for this video are to describe the epidemiological triangle, define the terms reservoir of disease and give examples, and then to distinguish between different routes of transmission, direct contact and indirect contact. A critical fact of epidemiology is that infectious disease does not happen out of the blue. The traditional epidemiologic triangle model suggests that infectious diseases result from interactions between an infectious agent, could be a bacterium, a virus, a fungus, what have you, a susceptible host, and an environment where the infectious agent and the host are brought together, causing disease in the host. By this model, disease transmission occurs when an infectious agent leaves a reservoir or a host via a portal of exit and is then conveyed by a mode of transmission to the portal of entry for the susceptible host. The portals that pathogens use to exit an infectious host may be the same ones used for entry in the susceptible host. For example, someone can become infected with influenza, like these people over here, when they inhale the virus on saliva droplets or mucus droplets from an infected host. When those viruses come in contact with the epithelial cells of the respiratory mucosa on the susceptible host, they may infect the cells and then be released by those same cells when the newly infected host sneezes, coughs, or talks. In both of your hosts here, the one that was infected and the one that was susceptible, the entry and release points, portals, are the respiratory mucosa. Reservoirs are continual sources of infection. These are the habitats in which a pathogen may normally live and or grow and multiply. Reservoirs can be human. For example, we are reservoirs for many sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, HIV, gonorrhea, herpes virus, as well as for measles, mumps, shingles, and respiratory pathogens. Occasionally, people may be able to transmit disease, but they show no outward symptoms or signs of disease. These people are called carriers. And they may have an inapparent infection or a subclinical infection. That is, they're infected, but they don't show the signs or symptoms of it. Sometimes these people can be in the incubation period for a disease or the convalescence period. Sometimes the pathogen has become part of their normal flora, so they don't get sick, but when they come in contact with other people, they transmit that microbe to the other person. This happens sometimes with meningitis. It gets transmitted to someone else and they actually get sick. Sometimes the pathogen is inside the carrier, but it's inactive, so they're unaware of their infection. I know that periodically when immigrants come to this country, they have to get a tuberculosis test, and the doctors are looking to see if people are infected, although they don't have an active infection. So these visitors, hopefully future Americans, can actually transmit that inactive microbe to someone else and then make them sick. Animals can also be reservoirs. They are able to transmit diseases like rabies, Lyme disease, anthrax, to each other or to humans. Diseases that are transmissible to humans under natural conditions from vertebrate animals are called zoonoses. Zoonoses. So these are, again, animal diseases that can be transmitted to humans under normal natural conditions. Believe it or not, even non-living things like soil and water can be reservoirs of disease. Botulism and histoplasmosis are infections caused by a bacterium and a fungus, respectively, that grows in soil. Legionnaire's disease is a respiratory infection that's caused by a bacterium that's transmitted by water vapor from cooling towers or evaporative condensers. So that water vapor, or the water on the cooling towers or the evaporative condensers, serves as a reservoir for the bacterium, and then it gets aerosolized in water vapor. In order for an infection to happen, an infectious agent must be transmitted from its reservoir or infected host to a susceptible host. Transmission happens in two primary ways: via direct contact transmission or indirect contact transmission. In direct contact, a susceptible host has to touch the infectious agent directly. For example, let's think about sexually transmitted diseases like mono or gonorrhea, or think about ringworm. These are all contracted via skin-to-skin contact with infectious individuals. The cat that has ringworm rubs around your legs and transmits the fungus to your skin directly. You kiss a boyfriend or girlfriend and they transmit the mononucleosis virus to you. It's Epstein-Barr, by the way. Or you contract gonorrhea through sexual contact. Okay, so that's what we mean by direct. Someone is touching the microorganism directly. Direct contact can also occur when humans touch contaminated soil or contaminated water. Droplet transmission is a form of contact transmission that refers to the large, heavy droplets of mucus or water or saliva that's produced when someone sneezes or coughs or talks. These droplets are so heavy that they may suspend in the air momentarily, but they don't really travel more than a meter out from the person who's doing the sneezing, coughing, or talking. Many respiratory infections are actually transmitted this way, in addition to meningococcal diseases and whooping cough. So as you can see in this figure, droplet size is here. Then we have someone who's infected and other people who are nearby. Okay, so as this person talks and spews virus, for example, or some other microbe, someone who is within about a meter's distance of that person is likely to get hit by tiny droplets of saliva and mucus carrying an infectious agent. And this person is susceptible to infection as a result. Indirect contact transmission refers to the spread of infectious agents from a host or reservoir by inanimate objects, or dust particles, or vectors, or food or water. We will consider each of these forms of indirect transmission independently. Many forms of indirect transmission involve fomites. These are inanimate objects that can transmit infectious particles. Fomite transmission occurs when germs are left on an object and a susceptible host comes by and touches that object, becoming infected soon after. Earlier this semester, we talked about how fungal diseases like athlete's foot are transmitted when people walk in bare feet along contaminated floors at the gym. During cold and flu season, doorknobs, dirty dishes, and dirty tissues are common fomites, as people who are perhaps in the late incubation period, prodromal period, or period of decline for cold and flu may use these tools after blowing their nose or sticking them in their mouth. Using these tools in the mouth or after blowing your nose deposits viral particles onto the surfaces. As the viruses can persist for 3 to 7 days on some surfaces, it's possible that an unsuspecting host could come along and get infected. I know this used to happen in our household. One of my family members used to be really bad about leaving dirty tissues around when they were sick. And the rest of us would go behind them and clean those tissues up. But if we got distracted by a phone call or a conversation or a quick emergency, we might not make it to the bathroom to wash our hands immediately after touching the tissues. Then when we touched our face, our nose, rubbed our eyes, we basically got infected with the cold that the other person had. A second method of indirect contact transmission is airborne transmission. This happens when infectious particles or microbes are carried on dust or tiny particles called droplet nuclei. These particles are so small that they can remain suspended in the air for several hours, or they can be resuspended. So let's say the particles fall out of the air onto a desktop or onto soil and a strong wind comes up. Those particles could then be resuspended. These droplet nuclei and dust particles usually travel 6 feet or more away from the person who emitted them by sneezing, coughing, talking, what have you. Vehicle transmission is a form of indirect contact transmission in which an inanimate reservoir like food or water, or maybe it's a biological product like blood, is involved. Vehicles can either passively carry an infectious agent, or they may provide an environment in which the agent actually grows, multiplies, or produces a toxin. Waterborne and foodborne are two examples of vehicle transmission. Some places that you may look at vehicle transmission may also include airborne, which we talked about on the last slide. All right, waterborne transmission occurs when infectious agents are spread by water. And usually these are pathogens that you find in untreated or poorly treated sewage. So an example of this would be cholera. If you think back several years now, it's probably been about 10 years, there was a massive earthquake in Haiti. Now for 100 years prior to that earthquake, there hadn't been any cases of cholera. But after the earthquake, the sanitation system was basically destroyed. Latrines were no longer a thing, and many people came down with cholera as a result because you had sewage that was basically contaminating water that people were drinking. Foodborne transmission happens via foods that are either incompletely cooked or poorly refrigerated, or maybe they're prepared under unsanitary conditions. I'm thinking about E. coli here and salmonella. So we've all heard about how people have gotten really severe intestinal diseases from eating undercooked hamburger. That's an example of foodborne transmission. People cutting meat on a cutting board, like this raw chicken here, place bacteria onto the cutting board via the food. And then if the cutting board isn't washed properly, and let's say the next thing to get cut on that cutting board is salad, then the bacteria wind up in the salad, that gets ingested, and again, foodborne transmission of disease. Vector transmission occurs when arthropods such as mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, cockroaches, sandflies, or houseflies transmit infectious agents either by mechanical or biological means. Mechanical means that the arthropod picks up a pathogen on its legs, leg hairs, or feet as it walks across a contaminated surface, and then it wipes those pathogens off onto other surfaces that it may walk upon. In the developing world, cockroaches and houseflies have been identified as significant transmitters of medically relevant microorganisms and parasites through mechanical transmission. Typically, these insects walk around in unsanitary conditions such as open air latrines, morgues, or huge garbage garbage heaps located near refugee camps sometimes, or in extremely poor villages or rural areas. And the insects pick up pathogens responsible for diarrheal diseases, typhoid fever, and dysentery. Then they walk over to food in an open air market or maybe in someone's home, and they contaminate fresh food with the pathogens that they picked up on their legs and feet. When those foods are eaten without proper cleaning or cooking, disease can result. We don't really think about these things in the United States because our infrastructure provides adequate sanitation to reduce or prevent this kind of transmission, but it's a major problem in other parts of our world. Biological transmission occurs when there's an intimate relationship between an insect and a pathogen. With the mechanical that I was just talking about, these arthropods can pick up any random microbe that just happens to be in the environment. But with biological transmission, an insect like a fly, a tick, blowfly, or mosquito becomes exposed to a pathogen by taking a blood meal. The pathogen then has to grow inside of that insect, that arthropod, and it matures in the gut or in salivary glands. Then, when the insect bites the susceptible host, they'll often regurgitate blood into the wound, back into the bite, and this carries the pathogen from the salivary glands or from the gut into the wounds they made via the bite. Alternatively, they may defecate into the wound as they move around the body after biting. So, in this way, specific types of pathogens become introduced to susceptible hosts via a bite. So biological transmission by definition requires a bite, a wound of some sort, whereas mechanical transmission doesn't. This video was all about disease transmission. We started out by describing the epidemiological triangle. Remember, this is a triangle that relates infectious agents with susceptible hosts and then the environment that brings them together so that the susceptible host becomes infected and progresses to a disease. We also said that infectious disease does not come out of nowhere, that there's usually some sort of interaction involved. We also defined the term reservoir of disease. We said that there were three types. You had humans, you had animals, and then you have non-living or inanimate reservoirs. We said reservoirs were kind of like a perpetual source of infection. These are environments that provide the necessities for infectious agents to grow and multiply. We also talked a bit about how transmission occurs. We compared methods of direct contact transmission to methods of indirect contact transmission. In the next video, we're going to try to put some of these things together and talk a little bit about healthcare associated infections and infection control. I look forward to seeing you there. That's going to be the last video for this series, so hopefully by the end of the next video you will have seen all 4 parts of this series and you'll be ready to move on to the next chapter.